In the book of Matthew, we're told the story of Jesus and the disciples traveling by boat to a remote area. At least they were hoping it was going to be remote. The Bible doesn't say it, but you can kind of get the idea that they were looking for a little R&R. When they arrived, there were, the Bible maybe exaggerates a little bit, but they were told that there were thousands of people there, 5,000 people there, exactly. In fact, this is the whole crowd where we got to hear of the miracle of feeding 5,000 with the loaves and fishes. But that's not where I want to go with this today. At the end of that day, Jesus was still looking for some time away. And so he sent the disciples away back in the boat while he went into the desert to pray and to meditate. I think it's important, well, again, this is not the main thrust of the story, to recognize that while we point to Jesus as, maybe we would say being a special individual, Jesus still had to do his spiritual work. He still had a daily practice of prayer and meditation. We don't become realized individuals without spiritual practice. So Jesus goes off into the desert, and a storm blows up, or at least heavy winds, and then big waves come up. So in the morning, when Jesus reemerges, the disciples are still trying to make their way home. They're being tossed about, and they're way off course. And, Jesus, seeing that they need some help, just heads directly for them, walking on water. As he approaches the boat, the disciples, having never seen anything like this, assume that a ghost is approaching them, and they become very frightened. And yet, Jesus, when he gets there, just simply says, "Take heart, it's I. Don't be afraid." And if we pick up the narrative there, Peter answers him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, and he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" When they got back to the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." There's some fun metaphysics to this story. The disciples, as they are, out in the boat, notice that Jesus is apart from them. Jesus always represents our true nature, our Christ nature, the spirit within us, if you will. And when a story tells of Jesus being apart from a group, then those group of people are left to function on their individual consciousness, or their small self, as we sometimes call it. That self, as we've explored so many times in this community, is a more patterned sense of ourselves. As such, it can't really even open to all the possibility of life. And so when it sees something out of its context, like someone walking on water, it brings up a lot of fear or discomfort. That can't be so. That can't be right. There's a lot of judgment, a lot of fear. Remember, this part is a part of us that feels separate, that is always working to control its situation, always working to feel like it knows, feel like it's safe. When something steps out of that, it brings up a lot of fear. It's interesting that when Jesus approaches the boat, everyone stays in the boat except for one, and that's Peter. Peter metaphysically represents faith. And so that we can see that if we are going to somehow step out of, break loose from our patterned way of being, that we need faith. Faith is an interesting quality. It's actually a quality of being human. And we develop our faith by continuing to pay conscious awareness to what we have chosen to do and how it came out. Particularly, when we're talking spiritually, what we have felt guided to do. And when we've been able to step out in that guidance, what's the outcome been? Most often, in retrospect, we see that it was for our highest good. However, the circumstance came out, worked out in our life. I think it's also interesting that, and so true to life, that as Peter steps out of the boat, there's a certain confidence of which he is walking on water. And then the outer circumstances become more prevalent in his consciousness. And it's interesting, that would be the wind and the waves. It's interesting how that happens in our lives. That often we feel guided, we step out, and then life has its way, right, of eroding our sense of confidence, of aligning, pushing against the ego structure, if you will, where all the voices come out and say, you can't, this is crazy, what are you doing? And yet Jesus was there, our nature is always there. It's funny, this version of Jesus is a little bit judgy. What does he say? Ye of little faith, why did you doubt? Well, let's hope he was just joking with them, because the Christ that we know, our true nature is always supportive, always encouraging, actually not judging of us in any way, thrilled that we're just willing to break out of our patterned way of being. And then just one other thing I want to say about this scripture is, notice how 11 stayed in the boat. And they watched as Jesus calmed the water, as Jesus brought Peter back into the boat. And of course, they're praising him. But what exactly are they praising? They're praising something outside of them. They don't really understand, as Peter would have gotten to embody, that this is something that isn't just part of me. This is me. I am the embodiment of spirit. And thus, you're not, how can I put it? You no longer feel this vulnerability to life of being just battered by life and needing to constrict around life and control yourself. Instead, you begin to understand that you have the capacity to really engage with life, to dance with life, or to walk on water if need be. It's an empowered place to be. And so, it begs the question, in your own life, are you ready to step out of the boat? Are you ready to accept the invitations of your life that are inviting you symbolically into walking on water, into the unknown? And yet the potential, can you imagine, even though the Bible never touches on it again, can you imagine the impact on Peter of getting to take steps on the water and to realize that he can do something that is mind-boggling to most people? That's the potential of my life and of your life. We're starting a 6-week series today on Elizabeth Lesser's book, Broken Open. Oh, and I love the subtitle, How Difficult Times Can Help Us Grow. And Elizabeth tends to focus on pretty significant events in life: divorce, death, health issues. But I'm going to be, I think, probably through this whole series, reminding you that life is trying to break you open with even small little callings in our life, small little events. Nothing huge, and yet the choice to step out of the boat always feels so large. Elizabeth does, I think, a really beautiful job of starting out by bringing us into awareness of the soul. You know, in Unity, we talk a lot about the soul. Sometimes we call it consciousness. It's both our individual consciousness and a greater consciousness. The soul is not something actually that you can see, but actually you can sense it and feel it. The soul is, we know at its heart, malleable. It is the collection point of spirit. And so as such, it is always working as spirit does to bring greater and greater understanding, greater and greater freedom to express greater and greater potential. And yet the soul can also become structured, which is what we know as the ego, that pattern part of us that's formed from pretty significant events in our life where we draw very clear beliefs about life, and then we start structuring our life around it. What's interesting, though, about the soul is it's very accommodating. It'll go pretty much along with anything, but after a while, it gets bored. You may not be aware that you're bored, but your soul gets bored. Your soul wants to experience more. And so usually we go through our 20s, and it's just fine with us thinking that we are unharmable by life, that we've got life by the tail, and that we're efforting and pushing or whatever we're doing. And then, okay, I'm ready for something new. And that's where, we used to read about midlife crisis, people just throwing their whole life away to change something new. There's a bit of a discontent that comes up. Elizabeth uses a Rumi poem to remind us of when we have not gotten so structured, but instead are able to open to the invitations of life and thus open up to the truth of life. It's a simple little piece. When you do something from your soul, you feel a river in you, a joy. These are not new concepts to us, are they? We talk all the time about being in the flow, feeling this sense of being carried by a flow, the flow of spirit, which is working through your soul, and a joy. Satisfaction and joy that comes when we align with something that is true within us, not some patterned, rote way of being. Elizabeth goes on to write, we may sense the presence of the river. We may feel a subtle longing to connect with it, but we're usually moving too fast, or we're distracted, or we fear disturbing the status quo of our surface thoughts and feelings. It can be unsettling to dip below the familiar and descend into the more mysterious realm of the soul. There's nothing more true than that statement. I love the fact that she talks about we're moving too fast. And again, I want to bring you back to the importance of spiritual practice. That when we're willing to pray and to meditate, we're interjecting positive words of affirmation into a constant chatter of the ego self, telling us how life is, who and how we are, and to be and what we are. It's important to slow down so that we don't miss the message of our soul, the guidance, if you will. that's always inviting us into this place of more, inviting us to break out of the tightness that becomes the structure of beliefs and patterns of being so that we can open to more experience of life. We got to see with Peter that it was an invitation to say yes, but it's not always an invitation to say yes. Sometimes we need to say no. About 10 days ago, I received an invitation to participate with a group of other spiritual teachers to work with a fairly, well, not, I'm not say fairly large, but a group of people over the next several years, guiding them through their spiritual journey. It's, in some ways, it's sort of an honor to be asked to do that. And immediately those inner voices in me started, a little chatter. This will be so great. You've got some realization. This is your opportunity to be of service, to share. When you teach something, you have an opportunity to understand it and deepen in it so much more that you're really going to grow through this. Chatter, chatter, chatter. But because I have now been meditating for 47 years, I was able to also hear a quiet or sense a quiet but persistent dread. I think when I was younger, I would have just ignored it. But I was curious. Why, with all the positivity of this invitation, would I be feeling a dread? And so, one of the things that I added to my spiritual practice years ago, along with prayer and meditation, is inquiry. And the whole assumption with inquiry is that the truth is within you. This is a basic unity teaching. Oh, sure. Guidance comes to us from all places, right? But we always check in with it in our interiority, within our consciousness. Is this my truth? And in inquiry, we go into a process of using our bodies to ground us, but questioning what's going on. And what I discovered after several inquiries, I have to admit, because at first it seemed so complex and so hard to sort out. But I soon began to see that as a kid, I didn't really fit into my family very well. And yet they were a major source of my sense of community, my sense of not being alone. That's probably the more key, that there was too much aloneness unless I hung out with my family. And so I participated in a lot of things that I would today choose not to participate in. Things that didn't really resonate, or didn't have any resonance within me. And then I also grew up in a family culture that was not so much about what brought you joy, but what was going to get you ahead. And so the idea was you jumped into these opportunities where you could grow, where you could receive some kind of acknowledgement, where you developed skills, for example. Whether you liked it or not, you jumped in. I hadn't really realized how much it had played into my life, but I could only think of like 4 or 5 things where I had said no. And as I opened to this dread, I realized that my soul seems to want to experience something other than efforting, something other than always working, something, I find that in ministry and in my work, There's always some amount of head work that I need to do. I need to be up in my mind. I need to be sorting things out. And there is some desire in me not to have to do that. And so 3 days ago, I wrote an email. I felt just like Peter did. I felt like I was stepping right out onto that water. I'd met with a great deal of shakiness in me as I'd explored this, because I realized this had become a support for me. I would call it a false support, but it was something that I sort of rested my being on. And so I wrote this email saying, really appreciate the opportunity, but I'm going to decline. And just 2 days, yesterday, 2 days later, I got a call from a friend of mine who assumed that I would be, of course, saying yes. That's who he knows of me, right? He's saying, oh my gosh, the opportunities we have. You can't believe what they're going to allow us to do. Usually only senior teachers get to do this kind of stuff. And I found myself go, again, right? The wind. This is what it does. Life has a way of always pushing up against the structure, pushing up against that assurance that, no, you can't do what you want to do. You can't believe what you want to believe. You need to go along with what we say is right. Luckily, I was able to breathe into it, able to reassure myself. That's something I didn't have as a kid, was the presence, the ability to be beyond my own reactivity, to comfort myself. But you see, there's an element of breaking open, that I was marching along, not even realizing that I was marching along in a pattern. I think many people would have been envious of all the opportunities the universe gives me, would not have noticed that I never say no. And that's an overstatement. And even when I've said no, then I felt guilty about saying no. I've not been free to trust that my life experience could be free of efforting, could really be in the flow and joyous. I loved what Elizabeth had to say about when we do cut ourselves off from the flow. And she's talking in the first person here. I shut down to my soul enough times to know what it feels like when the river is dammed. I know the feeling of deadness. I know how the river diverts itself and breaks through in other ways, as desire to blame or the emotion of anger, as physical illness, as restlessness or weariness or self-destruction. The soul always speaks. I want you to hear that. The soul always speaks. And sometimes it speaks the loudest when we block its flow, when we live only half a life, when we say, stay on the surface. I'd like to add that in that deadness, in that sense of restlessness, weariness, self-destruction, often, if we're not able to step out of the boat and walk on the water, then we go to numbing activities. And we all know what those are: drinking, drugging, sexing, overworking. I mean, it can be any number of things where we don't allow ourselves to be present. And so I think that if you're reading the book, I'll just tell you, Elizabeth goes to see a psychic. And the psychic very astutely asks her the question. The question is, what lesson does your soul want to learn? I'll say that again. The question is, what lesson does your soul want to learn? What an incredible guiding question. And this question may be hard to answer right in the beginning of the situations of our lives, but having done some inquiry around this invitation to teach, I would say that one of the lessons that my soul wants to learn is that I'm enough just as I am, that I don't need to control and strive and effort to be somebody or to be enough. That I can trust joy. That I can trust the flow. What is it that your soul is longing for? What lessons does it want to learn? The nature of life, the nature of each and every one of our egos is that it wraps tightly around our consciousness. And yet our soul can get bored with it. The soul, however, tends to speak more quietly. And so we have the wonderful blessing of the events of our life that work to break us open, and really to break us wide open. It's the invitation to step out of the boat onto the water and to learn that we can walk on the surface without sinking. It's the invitation to understand that even while the following of our guidance may be challenging and may be at first much more difficult than we thought, that our life becomes exciting, satisfying, juicy. It's the opportunity to learn that the Christ that is you can never leave you. What is it? What lesson is your soul wanting to learn? What a great question for us to explore over the next 6 weeks. And I invite you, just as I'm going to invite you now, to remember that much of what allows us to break open in our lives is our spiritual practice and the grounding and the quieting that it provides. And so let's move now into a time of meditation. And I'll just say, as I said last week, that the beauty of meditation is that it allows us to begin to develop our capacity to concentrate. And in that concentration, to not be entranced to the incessant babbling of our ego, of that patterned part of our soul. And so I invite you to just take a nice deep breath. I don't know how you're sitting, but if you don't have your legs cross-legged up underneath you with your spine erect, then see if you can put your legs flat on the floor. Remember, in concentrating, we're not concentrating on the activity of our mind. Allow your focus to be the gentle movement of your breath, in and out. Or if you're familiar with the Koth center, that center of gravity in the area of your belly button, put your attention there. When you find yourself back paying attention to the narrative of your mind, just gently bring yourself back to the focus, to the concentration. Gently bring your attention back to the movement of your breath. No judgment, just bring it back.